Talk Gnosis. This is part 1 of 4 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva of Virginia Tech. He's going to talk to us about divinization, deification, theosis, and all of those interesting concepts that have to do with becoming divine. He's going to talk to us about what those words mean, how they're related to various scriptures over the generations. We're going to talk a little bit about monotheism and how deification is maybe or maybe not incompatible with a monotheistic religion. We're also going to talk about Jesus and when he when the ideas about his divinity started to take shape. So stick around. You're going to want to catch all of this episode. It's very interesting. We always love having Dr. Litva on. And this is the second time he's been with us. So stay tuned for this episode, part 1 of 4, with Dr. M. David Litva, Personal Deification.
Dr. Litva, deification, divinization, and theosis. How do you define these three terms, and how do they differ from each other?
Well, it's a good question. Many people use them synonymously, and I think that's perfectly fine. Some people prefer to use theosis to designate specifically Christian forms of deification, but that's not universal. I personally use the term deification as the broadest possible term, and one that I think works best for historians.
And what does that word mean?
So, in its most simplest form, deification means becoming a god. From deus, the Latin word for God, and facio, meaning to make. So there already is in deification the sense of making a god. That's essentially what theosis means. It's the process of godding, or en-godding. Sometimes that's used in English. But more or less becoming a god. Some people use divinization as a lesser form of deification. So becoming divine would mean something less than becoming God. But that's not necessarily universal. People use that as synonymous as well.
Okay. Now this is a topic that you've written quite a bit about, but I understand that you have a new book, on this subject. Can you tell us a little bit about your new book and your impetus for writing it?
Sure. The new book that just came out from Oxford this October is called Desiring Divinity, Self-Deification in Jewish and Christian Traditions, or Jewish and Christian Myth-Making. And I wrote this book because I always found it fascinating that both in the Hebrew Bible and in Christian texts, you had figures who claimed divinity for themselves. And it's often the case that people write these figures off as megalomaniacal and evil or blasphemous, whereas that's not always the case. Some of these people who claim divinity, including Jesus himself, are not depicted as arrogant or prideful. They are depicted as absolutely correct. Although persecuted on earth, they are justified and eventually rise to the heavens. And the question is, why is that? And why do we have this contrast of some people making divine claims who end up roasting in hell or in an afterlife punishment and being persecuted as blasphemers? Why do we have that, this self-deifying rebel, contrasted with this self-deifying hero? And in the end, who's right? Should we deify ourselves? Is that inherently bad? Or is that just part of the human condition? That we're striving for something greater than ourselves? We're striving to be something to be greater than ourselves. Is that so bad? That's
right.
What the book looks at.
Oh, that's awesome. And it covers a fair amount of ground, right? You start back in the ancient world and you go right up until the modern day. Is that correct?
Well, that book is actually a previous book of mine, called Becoming Divine. In Desiring Divinity, I just treat ancient world.
Okay. you already touched on the Hebrew Bible. When I do the questions, this is your second time on the show. I write some infamously leading questions, so this is one of them.
Okay.
So these ideas about divinization, self-divinization in the Judaisms that we find in the Bible and existing up until the Second Temple. I'm saying Judaisms with an S, or I don't even like the term Judaism until after the Second Temple, but you know what I mean. The Semitic religion. How can you have divinization? Because isn't there just one God in monotheism? So if people are self-deifying, or if there's theosis, or if there's divinization, isn't that creating more gods? Are these ideas foreign to Judaism? Did they enter through the Hellenistic Greek culture that was in the Mediterranean?
Well, it's a great question, and it's important to ask because Jews even today pride themselves, or have a certain pride, for introducing monotheism, or at least supporting monotheism, which became our major theological tradition in the Western world. And monotheism is obviously important, but we have to be clear about what it is. And monotheism, as I understand it, means the centrality or primacy of power held by one particular deity. And in the Jewish case, that would be the deity called Yahweh. And there's no question that he has supreme power and that he is the supreme Lord of the universe. But that does not at all mean that he would exclude other deities in that universe. And we see time and time again in ancient Jewish texts where various figures are called gods, including beings that are called angels or malachim. The ghost of Samuel is called an Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God or gods. And we have figures like Enoch in the book of First Enoch, who takes a trip to heaven and ends up realizing that he is the Son of Man, or the Son of the Human, who is depicted as a prime mediator figure, God's right-hand man, so to speak, the universe. And this figure clearly is divine, because by virtue of receiving worship. And so, again, time and time again, we see in Jewish texts, right up in the Hebrew Bible, right up to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and into other pseudepigrapha, that there are various gods mentioned. And Yahweh does not seem to have a problem with that. And so we need to be clear that what we mean by deification in a Jewish sense indicates that there can indeed be many gods, as long as we're clear that one God has all the power, the central is still central in terms of having supreme power over these other deities. But I think that in many cases, not in all, Yahweh does welcome other gods into the divine family, sometimes called the divine council.
So when does this happen that there, the God, there's one primary God and then there are other kind of little gods, and when does it become kind of blasphemous to talk about other gods in that sense?
Well, there's a famous heresy mentioned in rabbinic texts called the Two Powers heresy, and the rabbis who were active in the 2nd and 3rd century CE were reacting against various sects that indicated that God did have a vizier, that is a prime minister figure who was operative in the creation. And for Christians, of course, this was Jesus, but for other groups, this would have been various other figures. You can imagine Enoch or the Son of Man, or etc., wisdom at creation. What seems to be happening is it's the rabbinic interpreters who are hammering out an exclusive monotheism, often in response to the Christian or Trinitarian version of monotheism. But I would have to say that even for the rabbis in the ancient world, they don't think of exclusive monotheism in quite the same way that we do. I would say throughout antiquity, there was always a sense that God did share power. And by virtue of sharing power and function and name, other people could be divine. even if there was a hesitancy to call these figures directly gods by the rabbinic period.
That does lead into my next leading question. There's a pretty common idea, I think, in sort of the secular West, that Jesus is this cool guy, right? The historical Jesus, and he travels around teaching, peace and love, and he's crucified, and then much later in the tradition, there's all these myths that grow up about him being divine. Is that view accurate in your view? Are these ideas about Jesus being a divine figure much later developments, and is this again something that's being brought in from so-called Hellenism or so-called Greek and pagan influence from around the Mediterranean?
Well, again, it's another great question. One of those really big questions that are very difficult to answer. But one thing
I was just going to say, Dr. Lebois, every question on the sheet tonight could basically be its show in itself. But sorry to interrupt. Please go on.
Well, one thing that we need to be clear on is that Hellenism never came in. And what I mean by that is, by the 1st century, that is the period in which Jesus is said to live, that what we call Hellenism had already been dominant in that culture for 300 years, that Alexander the Great had gone in a rampage and had conquered all those areas, including everything we call Palestine, 300 years before Jesus was born. So there's no question about Hellenism coming in. It was already there. It was simply the culture that Jews had been in for centuries. So if we're going to talk about outside influence, that metaphor makes no sense historically, because the Jews had already more or less acculturated and had formed a hybrid culture with everybody else in the Mediterranean world. So Hellenism, if that's what we want to call it, was just there. And we need to be prepared, I think, to talk about the mythologization of Jesus. But I think that those who think that the mythologization of Jesus occurred late or exclusively occurred late are simply mistaken. We need to take account of the fact that a lot of myths about people becoming divine had already been in place for centuries. And this idea that there was some kind of conspiracy and at the Council of Nicaea to make a poor Jewish peasant into the second person of the Trinity based on, Plato is ridiculous. The mythology is already in place for Jesus to become a divine figure, and it's probably true to a certain degree that Jesus himself may have thought that he was a divine figure because he applied that mythology to himself. And certainly after the visionary experiences of a resurrected Jesus, the early Christians would almost be forced to, in my opinion, think of this figure as divine. And within 20 years, I think, of these early resurrection visions, you have, I think, a fully divine Jesus as testified in the letters of Paul. This is not the divinization of Jesus, or the deification of Jesus is not a late movement, or at least it's not exclusively late. Occurs extremely rapidly for two reasons. Because the mythology of divine humanity is already in place. Jews already had Enoch and already had the king being thought of as the Son of God. And second, it is the result of powerful Christian experiences of Jesus as a resurrected heavenly figure. And if he's a resurrected heavenly figure, living immortal and exercising power of the cosmos, that figure is a god. So if we want to call that mythologization, that's fine, but that happened rapidly.
I've been having a lot of conversations lately about the ecumenical councils. I don't know what it is in the air, but the idea that the arguing about the divinity of Jesus was kind of the entirety of early Christianity, and groups having differing opinions on how divine was Jesus exactly, and was he divine when he was born, and all of this stuff, and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The way that I've kind of been describing it, and I actually don't know how accurate this is, but is different groups fighting with each other to promote their particular idea, and one idea or another winning out in a kind of popularity contest, and some people get punched in the face or whatever. But it seems to me that the divinity of Jesus being one of these points of argument, and not exactly whether Jesus was divine, but at what point he was divine, or how divine was he, and where does he fall in the hierarchy. What do you think kind of led to the Trinitarian concepts of Jesus as a co-eternal part of the one true divinity? And can you answer in 140 characters or less?
Well, I want to address something that you said, which I think is very accurate. The way I describe it is early Christianity is not a horse race. That is, it's often conceived that there are these early Christian groups competing, and with these competing Christologies, and some people won and some people lost. And I think that's a terrible way to view things, and terribly naive and inaccurate. There essentially are no winners and losers. That when you have traditions, they are used, reused, adapted, and recycled. And the ideas that seem to fade away are often those very ideas that are transformed into something new. And today's heresy often becomes tomorrow's orthodoxy if you can tweak it, and vice versa. So nobody really wins or loses. I mean, I admit that some people do get burned and destroyed, but the ideas are always in the process of rapid transformation and transmogrification, and people are going to adapt whatever it takes. And I think that this is really what happens as we get into the 4th century, and I'm actually not an expert in the 4th century. I'm an expert in the 1st and 2nd. But what I can say about these church councils is this is a way to finally come to grips with Christianity and the heritage of ancient philosophy. And what we call the Trinity is simply an attempt to make early Christian views of deity philosophically acceptable. And I think that a lot of people, this is rationalism. This is the attempt to make the faith look as rational as possible, even though at the end they say that it's a mystery, and that's fine. We don't really know what the Trinity is. My point, I think, is that these early Christians most early Christians, I would argue, agree that Jesus is divine in some sense. The question is, you've got a pushback later in the 4th century to combine a fully human and fully divine figure, and that causes some philosophical and logical problems, which were never at issue in the 1st and 2nd century. But in order to make the faith philosophically and rationally responsible to an elite, to a new Christian elite, that there was an attempt to hammer out a lot of the details. And unfortunately, as these creedal formations got more and more specific, more and more people got excluded. And it's just reality. The more precise you are, the less people you can please. So I don't have any magic answers of how we get from A to B, but that is what I can say.
This is part 2 of 4 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva of Virginia Tech, talking about deification, personal deification, divinization, theosis, and all that good stuff. Last time we talked about those things in relation to monotheism, and we talked about the divinity of Jesus and where those things, those ideas came from. In this episode, we're going to continue with that line of thought. We're going to talk about how kings and emperors were considered gods in the ancient world, and what that kind of political ramifications of divinity for regular human beings is in that context. We're talking about Gnostic cosmology as an act of political defiance, and we'll talk a little bit about which parts of the New Testament is Jesus actually considered divine, and which parts is he considered just a human being. If those are even relevant distinctions, stay tuned and you'll find out. Coming up on this episode, part 2 of 4 of our conversation, Dr. M. David Litva and personal deification.
We backtrack a little bit. Just in passing, we talked. You mentioned about how sort of the ground is already laid for understanding Jesus as a divine figure, and you mentioned the king, the king of Israel. And I understand. So the king of Israel was understood while he was alive to be a divine figure, and I also want to combine that with another question. Wasn't the Roman emperor somehow understood to be a god even when he was alive? But, these are both obviously men that people serve and can see and go to the royal court and touch. Like, how did people understand these rulers as simultaneously being gods? And did this affect any religious approaches? Did it have an impact in how people thought about divinity in the ancient Mediterranean world?
Absolutely. I like to think of ancient religion as simply politics, but it's the politics of heaven. Gods and kings are the exact analogs of each other, and so on heaven, or so in heaven, so on earth. So if you've got divine kings on earth, that really makes sense to an ancient person, because God actually is a king. And I don't think the ancients thought of that as a metaphor. I just think they thought of that as the absolute truth. God is a king. It's logical that kings on earth are gods. This is a phenomena, although a lot of people in Jewish studies would resist this, the idea that ancient Jews had a ruler cult. I think it's absolutely true that the king did receive a kind of veneration. He is actually called God. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, again using Elohim in the Psalms, and being called the Son of God in Psalm 2, are actually in a kind of ritual ceremony, apparently, where the king becomes the Son of God. I don't think the Son of God is just a cute metaphor. I think he really does become the Son of Yahweh, and therefore becomes worthy of the kind of worship and veneration that someone participating in Yahweh's power would receive. And although that may be offensive to some, I just think that's what the historical data points to. Now, it is true that you have ruler cult really ramping up after Alexander the Great, and it's really he who invents the Greek concept of divine kingship. And it's absolutely clear that he was in his lifetime considered son of Zeus and considered a divine being, and possibly considered himself to be a divine being, and was worshipped as such. And later rulers, his successors, experienced the same phenomena. They were living gods who had hymns and sacrifices in their honor. And when the Romans came along, it's absolutely true that they also received sacrifices and praise and worship that was due to a deity. It's true that there was some attempt to distinguish the kinds of sacrifices and praise that they received. For instance, in the Jewish temple, they would offer a sacrifice on behalf of Caesar Augustus rather than to him. And sometimes this would be repeated in other cult sites. But it's also true that not far from Jerusalem, in Caesarea Maritima, you had a temple of Caesar Augustus built by no less than Herod the Great, in which Caesar Augustus is depicted as the image of Zeus, and has a cult statue that is 40 feet high, and where Jews and non-Jews come to worship, and where the remains exist today. So it's absolutely clear that the Jews were familiar with ruler cult, and that the Roman emperors were worshipped in their lifetime. Did they actually see these rulers? Not really. But their image was ubiquitous. And if you go to any kind of museum today, especially in Italy, you will see thousands of images of the emperor depicted as a living god, because that is what he was. Did this influence how Christians thought of Jesus, the King of the universe? Absolutely. There's no question, if you are the king of the cosmos, that you are a divine figure. And the idea of a divine human being, although radical to us today, is absolutely standard and common in the ancient world. This is very hard for people to get their minds around, but it's absolutely everywhere in the culture. Deification is just the standard for those who rise to a certain level of authority and power. It's not just those who have, and for the philosophers who rise to a level of moral perfection.
That actually is pretty illustrative of how a figure in the Middle East at this time, calling himself, or his followers calling him, the Son of God, could actually be seen as a threat to the ruling elite. If the king is supposedly also a son of God.
I mean, I think that is very true. And a lot of people have wanted to say that certain texts in the Gospels and in the epistles of Paul are anti-imperial because they portray Jesus as cosmic Lord. But a point that I often like to mention is that may be anti-imperial, but it's also, in a sense, pro-imperial, because it's merely a change in the king. The Christians are using the same tropes, the same basic ideas for divinizing not the emperor, but this particular Jewish peasant from a no-name town in Nazareth. That's what's radical. But they are adapting all the time elements from the ruler cult, from their own political context, and applying it to Jesus. I don't see that as particularly anti-imperial. I see that as these gospel writers are using the imperial politics to their own advantage, and giving us a Jesus who is the true cosmocrator, the true pantocrator, the true one who is the emperor of the cosmos. They don't get there without Roman politics. It's impossible.
Can we stay on the anti-imperial theme just for a second to jump ahead to our precious Gnostics, or our precious Sapiens? Like you mentioned, it's just obvious to people at the time that God is a king, God is an emperor, right? Because they look around them, they see the God and the emperor who is the God on earth. As it is on earth, as you said, it must be above. So are the Archons and Yalda Bayoff, is that an anti-imperial or a reaction to what's going on Earth? Because I can see the thought process where you're dealing with a very annoying ruler, a bureaucrat, an unfair ruler. So you, obviously, if you're already in this worldview, you're like, well, that's what it must be like in heaven.
Well, I think you're onto something. I do think that there is political criticism in the Gnostic writings, but I also think that they take seriously the idea that our world really is controlled by evil superpowers, whom they do call archons or rulers. And so, in a sense, the emperor and his cronies and the whole Roman bureaucracy and administration is essentially a puppet show. The people really running the show are these demonic agents who are at the center and behind the scenes, sort of like the man behind the curtain and the Wizard of Oz, that they're the really ones who they are criticizing. And so the object of the criticism, yes, indirectly, is the Roman government and the bureaucracy and the terrible exploitation, economic and socially. But they really do think that those people are just an epiphenomenon of the actual evil demonic infrastructure running this entire cosmos. So, okay, it's anti-imperial, but that's only secondary.
Yeah, and echoes of that all the way up to the 70s, where you have Philip K. Dick talking about the empire never ended. And
right.
Yeah, it's and I think that's absolutely true. I think that the Sethians specifically were talking about a world in which these archons and spirits and whatever they were calling them were absolutely real, and they absolutely had their fingers in the pies of all of the the political machinations that were going on at the time, and we're actually talking about, when they talked about these archons, we're actually talking about the spiritual powers behind the scenes of the actual powers who were kind of puppets.
Right. I mean, it goes back to that phrase in Paul in 1 Corinthians where he says that the archons crucified the Lord of glory because they didn't know who he was. And the interpretive question is, who are the archons?
Right.
Is he actually talking about the human rulers, the Romans nailing Jesus to the cross, or is he talking about these demonic agents who are operative in the sky and behind the scenes? And I think it's really both and. But I think even for Paul, and if you want to call Paul a Gnostic,
and we do,
that's fine. But I think he's demonic infrastructure, and I think he really views these Romans as essentially puppets. And to speak against Rome and to be a political rebel, that makes no sense, because you're only fighting the epiphenomena. You're only fighting that superficial veneer. Mm-hmm. What Paul and the Gnostics are worried about is the man behind the curtain. That's the one you need to attack. That's the one you need to get by. That's the only way out of this universe.
Echoes to our current election cycle here in the United States.
the conspiracy theorists are going to definitely chime in the comments section.
Yes, please do. I love those. Those are fantastic.
Those are the best. Dr. Littva, you actually brought us up to my next two leading questions. We're going to touch on Paul on one of them and then get right into him in the next. But so I've heard this view that so basically a more traditional Christian view that the entire Christian Bible, what's sometimes called the New Testament, presents Jesus as the Son of God, fully human. And I've also heard from scholars and people on the internet, maybe not from scholars, but I've also heard that some books of the New Testament don't show Jesus as divine at all, like say Mark. And he's only divine in John and the Pauline letters. So those two views, are either of those correct?
Well, again, it's a good, complex, nice leading question. One thing that I will say is this formulation of fully divine, fully human is a 4th century formulation, and we need just to throw that out. Mm-hmm. In the 1st century, I'm not sure it's just not an issue. My own take on it is this, and it's only my take, that I think, let's use the example of the Gospel of Mark. So he looks like a normal human dude, and he goes around performing miracles and gets crucified in the end, and then by report rises from the dead. And in his trial, he says what he has been avoided saying throughout his entire ministry, that he actually is the Messiah. And he adds to that this prophecy from Daniel that he actually is the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of the power. Now, is this a divine figure? I think Mark leaves it a little bit ambiguous, but there are signs that he definitely is divine, and I would point to 2 signs. That in the Transfiguration scene, where all of a sudden this guy has beams of light bursting out of his clothes, and he starts talking with men who ought to be dead, and has this you have this overwhelming experience that can only be described as an epiphany, in which only gods really do that sort of thing. And then his final claim at the trial, that he is the Son of Man, or the Son of the Human, who will sit at the right hand of the power, I think tipped the balance for me. And I would say that this is a hidden God figure that we know occurs all over Greek and Roman mythology, where the gods come for a period of time and they don't reveal their true nature until usually the end, and they often give a sign.
They usually come to impregnate some random peasant woman, right?
Well, not always. If you're a reader of Homer, you're familiar with the gods intervening for any number of reasons, and they come in human form. They all come in human form. They never come in some divine or supernatural form. They're all hidden deities, and they deliberately hide themselves, and they sojourn on Earth, usually for a fairly short time. I think what actually
with the Bacchae, right? He's a normal human, and then he just all of a sudden he reveals himself at the end, after the city tears himself apart. Is that be an example?
What was your example?
Oh, sorry. The Bacchae.
Oh, okay. And Euripides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Euripides.
Yeah, I think that's a good example where you have Dionysus coming, obviously in disguised form, and he remains disguised for a long period of time throughout the entire play. And it's only in the end that, yes, he reveals his true form. And I think that this is basically the structure of the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus is deliberately hiding not only his messiahship, but also his divinity, and that it only becomes clear that he's a divine being when essentially you can't kill him. And even when you do kill him, he rises from the dead. But that's the ultimate proof of divinity. And we saw a sign of this in the Transfiguration, that he's a divine being and his divine form can burst out of his human form when he wants. And his claim to be essentially God's chief vizier, the cosmocrator who's going to rip through the skies at the end of time, that really can only describe a divine being in the ancient world. So I have to put my money on all the Gospels supporting a kind of divine Jesus. That doesn't at all mean that he's human, fully human, or human at all, but he certainly looks that way. And in Matthew, born human. But as you know, also from Greek mythology, you can have Heracles born from a human mother and still be a god, and you can have Romulus born from a human mother and be divinized in the end. This isn't a problem to be born. You can still become a god from your humanity. That's not a problem. Or in the case of the Johannine model, you can come as a pre-existent deity. Either way, I think we're dealing with a divine figure in almost every book of the New Testament. Some books, frankly, don't talk a lot about Jesus, so we don't know.
I'm taking shots at the enemy. I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy.